The story of the Prague Spring begins not with tanks or decrees, but with exhaustion, a quiet, accumulated weariness that had settled over Czechoslovakia by the mid-1960s. As a country that once stood among Central Europe's most industrialized and culturally vibrant societies, found itself suffocating under the rigidities of Stalinist rule, long after the terror of the early Cold War had passed, its economy stagnating, its intellectual life constrained, and its political leadership increasingly detached from the realities of everyday life. Unlike many other Eastern Bloc states, Czechoslovakia had a strong democratic tradition before the Second World War, and this memory lingered beneath the surface, shaping expectations and frustrations as citizens compared their present condition not only to the capitalist West, but to their own lost past, a contrast that made ideological conformity feel particularly hollow. By the early 1960s, economic decline forced even party officials to acknowledge that central planning had failed to deliver prosperity, leading to cautious internal debates about reform that gradually expanded beyond technical adjustments into questions of political legitimacy, censorship, and the role of the Communist Party itself. Writers, economists, students, and journalists began pushing the boundaries of what could be said, often framing their critiques not as rejections of socialism, but as efforts to rescue it from bureaucratic decay, a strategy that allowed dissent to grow within the system rather than against it. This atmosphere of cautious experimentation coincided with shifts in Moscow, where Nikita Khrushchev's earlier denunciation of Stalin had opened limited space for reform across the bloc, even as the memory of crushed uprisings in Hungary in 1956 served as a stark reminder of the limits of permissible change. In Czechoslovakia, however, the pressure for reform proved unusually persistent, driven by a combination of economic necessity and cultural confidence. And by 1964, it became clear that the ruling Communist Party could no longer contain the ferment through minor adjustments alone. Internal party struggles culminated in January 1968 with the removal of Antonín Novotný, a hardline leader whose rigid approach had alienated both reformers and pragmatists, and his replacement by Alexander Dubček, a Slovak party official perceived as loyal to socialism but open to change, a compromise figure who seemed capable of restoring credibility without provoking Moscow. Dubček's rise marked a turning point, not because he intended to dismantle the socialist system, but because he believed it could be humanized, reformed from within to align more closely with the needs and aspirations of society, a vision he famously described as socialism with a human face. Under his leadership, the pace of reform accelerated rapidly as censorship was relaxed, public debate flourished, and long-suppressed grievances found expression in newspapers, radio broadcasts, and public forums that had once served as instruments of propaganda. The atmosphere in Prague and other cities changed almost overnight as citizens experienced an unfamiliar sense of freedom, gathering in cafes, universities, and workplaces to discuss politics openly, challenge dogma, and imagine a future in which socialism did not require fear or silence. These changes were not imposed from above, but emerged through a dynamic interaction between reform-minded officials and an energized society, creating a momentum that soon outpaced the cautious intentions of the party leadership itself. The Communist Party's action program, unveiled in April 1968, codified many of these aspirations, promising economic decentralization, legal protections, freedom of expression, and limits on the power of the security services, while affirming continued membership in the Warsaw Pact and loyalty to socialism, an attempt to reassure Moscow even as it transformed domestic life. To many Czechoslovaks, this moment felt like a long-delayed reconciliation between ideology and reality, a chance to build a system that combined social justice with personal freedom, and the optimism it generated was palpable, visible in art, literature, and everyday conversation. Yet this optimism carried within it a dangerous ambiguity, because while Dubček and his allies insisted that reform strengthened socialism, leaders in the Soviet Union and other Eastern Bloc states viewed the Prague Spring through a very different lens, one shaped by fear of contagion, ideological erosion, and the loss of control over a strategically vital region of Europe. In Moscow, Leonid Brezhnev and his colleagues watched developments in Czechoslovakia with growing alarm, concerned not only about the substance of the reforms, but about the example they set, fearing that liberalization in Prague would inspire similar demands in East Germany, Poland, and the Soviet Union itself, undermining the cohesion of the bloc and the authority of communist rule. Soviet intelligence reports emphasized the loosening of censorship, the emergence of independent organizations, and the questioning of party leadership as signs that counter-revolutionary forces were gaining ground, even as Dubček repeatedly assured Moscow that Czechoslovakia remained firmly committed to socialism and alliance obligations. This divergence in perception created a widening gap between intention and interpretation, as reforms designed to save socialism were read as steps toward its dismantling, a gap that dialogue struggled to bridge. Throughout the spring and summer of 1968, a tense diplomatic dance unfolded, with Czechoslovak leaders traveling to meetings with Soviet and Warsaw Pact officials, offering reassurances, adjusting rhetoric, and agreeing to vague compromises that satisfied neither side, while domestic pressure continued to push reforms forward. Within Czechoslovakia, public enthusiasm made reversal politically impossible, as any attempt to reimpose censorship or roll back freedoms would have triggered outrage and undermined Dubček's legitimacy, leaving the leadership trapped between an emboldened society and an increasingly hostile alliance. The irony of the Prague Spring lay in this very success, because the more vibrant and open Czechoslovak society became, the more it exposed the contradictions at the heart of the Eastern Bloc, challenging the notion that socialism required uniformity and repression to survive. By the summer of 1968, Soviet patience was wearing thin, and military exercises near Czechoslovakia's borders took on a more ominous tone, signaling that the limits of tolerance were approaching even as negotiations continued. Ordinary citizens sensed the tension, but largely refused to believe that invasion was inevitable, clinging to the hope that reform could coexist with alliance loyalty, and that the lessons of Hungary would not be repeated. This hope was not naive, so much as deeply human, rooted in the belief that reason, dialogue, and shared ideology might prevail over fear and force, a belief that sustained the Prague Spring, even as the machinery of intervention quietly assembled around it, preparing to bring one of the Cold War's most hopeful experiments to a sudden and violent end. As summer deepened in 1968, the Prague Spring entered a phase defined by mounting tension and fragile optimism, as the momentum of reform continued to reshape daily life, while the shadow of intervention grew steadily darker, creating an atmosphere in which hope and anxiety coexisted uneasily across Czechoslovakia. Newspapers and radio stations pushed the boundaries of newly relaxed censorship, publishing investigative pieces on past abuses, corruption, and the failures of central planning, while writers and artists seized the opportunity to explore themes long suppressed, transforming public culture into a forum for collective self-examination that went far beyond what party leaders had originally anticipated. For many citizens, this flowering of expression was not simply political, but deeply personal, offering a sense of dignity and agency that had been absent for years and reinforcing the belief that reform was both irreversible and morally justified. Yet this very openness intensified fears in Moscow and among hardline leaders in neighboring Warsaw Pact states, who interpreted the proliferation of independent voices as evidence that the Communist Party was losing its monopoly on power, a development they regarded as incompatible with the security and ideological cohesion of the socialist camp. Behind closed doors, Soviet leaders debated the risks of inaction versus intervention, weighing the danger that reformist ideas might spread against the political and military costs of using force against a fellow socialist state. A calculation complicated by the fact that Czechoslovakia had not announced any intention to leave the Warsaw Pact or align with the West. Dubček and his allies continued to argue that loyalty and reform were not mutually exclusive, emphasizing that socialism could adapt without collapsing, and that a more open system would ultimately strengthen rather than weaken the bloc by restoring popular legitimacy. These assurances, however, failed to convince leaders who viewed control as the foundation of stability and who remembered too clearly how quickly reform movements in Hungary had escalated beyond their original demands in 1956. Throughout June and July, a series of tense meetings took place between Czechoslovak and Soviet officials, including high-profile negotiations intended to set clear boundaries for reform, during which Dubček reiterated commitments to party leadership and alliance obligations while resisting demands to reinstate censorship and suppress independent organizations. The resulting statements were deliberately ambiguous, allowing each side to claim reassurance while leaving fundamental disagreements unresolved, a diplomatic stalemate that postponed confrontation without addressing its causes. On the ground, however, the reforms continued to deepen as workers' councils formed in factories, students organized discussions and demonstrations, and public trust in the reformist leadership grew, making any abrupt reversal increasingly untenable. The sense that history was being made fostered a collective confidence that reason would ultimately prevail, a belief reinforced by the absence of overt repression and by the fact that negotiations, however strained, were still ongoing. This confidence was not shared by all, and within Czechoslovakia itself there were officials and citizens who feared that the pace of change was provoking a reaction that the country could not withstand, warning privately that Moscow's tolerance had limits and that the price of miscalculation could be severe. Such warnings, however, struggled to gain traction amid the prevailing optimism, as the lived experience of newfound freedom made the prospect of reversal feel abstract and implausible. Meanwhile, Warsaw Pact military maneuvers near Czechoslovakia's borders grew more frequent and conspicuous, officially framed as routine exercises, but widely understood as signals of pressure. Reminders that ultimate power lay not in Prague, but in Moscow. Soviet media coverage of Czechoslovakia hardened in tone, emphasizing disorder, ideological deviation, and the alleged influence of hostile forces, narratives designed to justify stronger measures, both domestically and within the alliance. This shift in rhetoric marked a subtle but significant escalation, as it prepared the ideological ground for intervention by framing reform not as a socialist experiment, but as a threat to socialism itself. Despite these warning signs, Dubček and much of the Czechoslovak leadership remained committed to dialogue, believing that compromise could still avert catastrophe, and that the shared history and interests of the socialist camp would ultimately restrain Moscow from using force. This belief reflected not ignorance of power realities, but a calculated gamble rooted in the hope that the Soviet Union, constrained by international opinion and wary of repeating the trauma of Hungary, would choose containment over invasion. As July turned to August, the gamble grew increasingly perilous, as intelligence reports indicated that contingency plans for military intervention were being finalized, and as the presence of foreign troops near the borders became impossible to ignore. Ordinary citizens sensed that something was wrong, yet life continued with an air of defiant normalcy. Cafes remained full, debates continued, and newspapers still published freely, creating a poignant contrast between the vibrancy of the present and the threat looming just beyond it. This contrast would soon define the tragedy of the Prague Spring, as a society that had briefly tasted the possibility of change found itself on the brink of a confrontation it neither sought nor could prevent, caught between the promise of reform and the reality of power in a divided Cold War Europe. In the final days before the invasion, the tension surrounding the Prague Spring hardened into a quiet, ominous certainty among those who understood the signals of power, even as official reassurances continued to mask the scale of the danger, because by mid-August 1968, the decision to intervene had already been made in Moscow, shaped by months of frustration, fear of ideological contagion, and the conviction that allowing Czechoslovakia's experiment to continue would fatally weaken the authority of communist rule across Eastern Europe. The Soviet leadership, supported by hardline allies within the Warsaw Pact, concluded that reform had crossed an invisible line, not because it threatened immediate military alignment with the West, but because it demonstrated that socialism could exist without repression, a precedent far more dangerous than defection, and one that could not be allowed to stand. Military preparations accelerated under strict secrecy, with troops from the Soviet Union, East Germany, Poland, Hungary, and Bulgaria placed on alert and positioned to move rapidly into Czechoslovakia, while diplomatic engagement continued just long enough to preserve the appearance of negotiation and to minimize international backlash. In Prague, Dubček and his colleagues remained trapped in a narrowing corridor of options, aware of mounting pressure, yet still hoping that restraint and loyalty would be rewarded, a hope reinforced by their own commitment to socialism and by the belief that the Soviet Union would hesitate to use force against a reform movement that explicitly rejected counter-revolution and violence. This miscalculation reflected a fundamental asymmetry of perspective, as Czechoslovak leaders judged events through the lens of domestic legitimacy and ideological renewal, while Moscow assessed them through the imperatives of control, precedent, and geopolitical cohesion. On the night of August 20th, 1968, this asymmetry was resolved by force, as Warsaw Pact troops crossed Czechoslovakia's borders in one of the largest military operations in Europe since the Second World War, moving swiftly to seize airports, communication centers, and key infrastructure in a coordinated effort designed to paralyze resistance before it could organize. Tanks rolled into Prague and other major cities under the cover of darkness, their presence shattering the illusion that reform could be negotiated within the existing power structure and confronting citizens with the brutal reality of occupation by supposed allies. The invasion unfolded with an efficiency that underscored the imbalance of power, as Czechoslovak forces were ordered not to resist, leaving civilians to face the occupying troops armed only with words, signs, and acts of symbolic defiance that expressed outrage without offering a path to victory. Crowds gathered in streets and squares, confronting soldiers with arguments, appeals, and questions that revealed both moral courage and deep confusion, as ordinary people struggled to understand how a movement committed to socialism could be crushed in the name of socialism itself. Radio stations became focal points of resistance, broadcasting appeals for calm, unity, and non-violence, even as they were hunted down and silenced, their voices flickering on and off the air in a desperate effort to assert national agency amid overwhelming force. The emotional impact of the invasion was immediate and profound, as shock gave way to grief and anger, and as the promise of the Prague Spring collapsed under the weight of foreign tanks, leaving behind a sense of betrayal that would shape Czechoslovak society for decades. Soviet leaders attempted to justify the intervention by invoking the threat of counter-revolution and the need to defend socialism, framing the invasion as an act of fraternal assistance rather than aggression, a narrative that convinced few within Czechoslovakia and even less outside the socialist camp. International reaction was swift but limited, as Western governments condemned the invasion rhetorically while avoiding actions that might escalate into direct confrontation, reinforcing the reality that Czechoslovakia's fate lay firmly within the Soviet sphere of influence. Within the Eastern Bloc, the invasion sent a chilling message to reformers and dissidents, demonstrating that the limits of permissible change were enforced by military power, and that ideological loyalty offered no protection once control was perceived to be at risk. Dubček and other Czechoslovak leaders were arrested and taken to Moscow, where they faced intense pressure to reverse reforms and legitimize the occupation, a process that culminated in agreements that effectively ended the Prague Spring while preserving a facade of continuity. The return of these leaders, visibly shaken and constrained, symbolized the defeat of reformist socialism and the reassertion of centralized control. As censorship was reimposed, independent organizations dismantled, and political life brought back under strict supervision. The invasion of August 1968 thus marked a decisive turning point, not only for Czechoslovakia, but for the entire Cold War order in Europe, exposing the true boundaries of sovereignty within the socialist bloc, and revealing that the ultimate arbiter of political change was not ideology or popular support, but the readiness to deploy force. The tragedy of the Prague Spring lay not only in its suppression, but in the clarity it brought to the nature of power, as a hopeful experiment that sought to reconcile socialism and freedom was crushed to preserve a system that increasingly relied on coercion rather than consent, leaving behind a legacy of disillusionment that would quietly undermine communist legitimacy long after the tanks withdrew. In the aftermath of the invasion, Czechoslovakia entered a period officially described as normalization, a term that concealed the profound rupture inflicted on society by the violent end of the Prague Spring, as the occupying forces remained in place and a systematic effort began to dismantle the reforms, silence dissent, and restore a rigid form of party control designed to ensure that the events of 1968 could never be repeated. Alexander Dubček, briefly retained as a figurehead to provide an appearance of continuity, was gradually stripped of power and replaced by Gustav Husak, a leader willing to implement Moscow's demands in full, overseeing the reimposition of censorship, the purging of reformers from the Communist Party, and the reintegration of security services into every aspect of public life. Tens of thousands of party members were expelled, careers were destroyed, and intellectual life was driven back underground. As writers, journalists, academics, and artists who had flourished during the Prague Spring were forced into silence, exile, or menial labor, their exclusion serving as both punishment and warning. The normalization process did not rely on mass terror in the Stalinist sense, but on a quieter, pervasive system of pressure and conformity, in which access to education, employment, and social advancement was conditioned on political obedience, creating a climate of resignation that replaced the earlier surge of optimism. For many citizens, The emotional impact of this reversal was deeper than fear alone, as the brief experience of freedom made its loss acutely painful, fostering a sense of betrayal not only by the Soviet Union, but by the very idea that reform within the system was possible. Emigration surged as those who could leave chose exile over accommodation, depriving the country of a generation of talent and reinforcing the stagnation. Normalization was meant to stabilize. Internationally, the invasion prompted widespread condemnation and intensified skepticism about the moral legitimacy of Soviet leadership, even among Western communist parties that had previously aligned themselves with Moscow, accelerating a broader ideological fracture within the global left. The Soviet justification for intervention was soon formalized into what became known as the Brezhnev Doctrine, which asserted the right of the Soviet Union to intervene in any socialist country where socialism itself was deemed to be under threat, effectively codifying limited sovereignty within the Eastern Bloc and making explicit the principle that ideological conformity outweighed national independence. This doctrine had far-reaching consequences, shaping the behavior of communist regimes across Eastern Europe and reinforcing a climate of caution and repression that would persist until the late 1980s. Within Czechoslovakia, resistance did not disappear entirely, but it became fragmented, subdued, and often symbolic, expressed through acts of moral defiance rather than organized political challenge, as exemplified by figures such as Jan Palach, whose self-immolation in January 1969 shocked the nation and embodied the depth of despair felt by those who saw no other means of protest. Such acts resonated powerfully, but also underscored the limits of resistance under occupation, as the machinery of normalization proved effective in isolating dissent and preventing it from coalescing into a movement capable of challenging state power. Over time, the memory of the Prague Spring became a suppressed but persistent undercurrent in Czechoslovak society, preserved in private conversations, samizdat publications, and cultural memory rather than public discourse, shaping a quiet skepticism toward official ideology that eroded belief without provoking confrontation. The long-term effect of this erosion was subtle but significant, as normalization produced outward stability at the cost of legitimacy, creating a political order that endured not because it inspired loyalty, but because it offered predictability in exchange for compliance. This trade-off sustained the regime for 2 decades, yet it also hollowed it out, leaving it vulnerable when external conditions changed, and the Soviet Union itself began to question the assumptions that had justified intervention. The suppression of the Prague Spring thus achieved its immediate objective of restoring control, but at the price of extinguishing the possibility of reform from within, ensuring that when change eventually came, it would not be gradual or negotiated, but abrupt and transformative. In this sense, the invasion of 1968 planted the seeds of its own undoing, as the memory of a lost alternative continued to haunt the system, shaping the aspirations of a generation that would later seize the opportunity for peaceful revolution when the structures of power finally weakened. The legacy of normalization therefore extended far beyond Czechoslovakia, serving as both warning and lesson across Eastern Europe, demonstrating the costs of reform and the fragility of sovereignty within the socialist camp, while also revealing the limits of coercion as a foundation for long-term stability. The Prague Spring, though crushed, was not erased, and its failure became an enduring reference point for understanding both the resilience and the ultimate brittleness of Cold War authoritarianism. A reminder that the suppression of hope can sustain order only temporarily, and that the contradictions exposed in 1968 would resurface with greater force when the Cold War itself began to unravel. The broader significance of the Prague Spring became fully apparent only in hindsight, as its suppression reshaped the psychological and political landscape of Europe in ways that extended far beyond Czechoslovakia's borders, marking a decisive moment when the possibility of reformist socialism was publicly extinguished and replaced by a hardened acceptance of division that would define the Cold War's remaining decades. In Western Europe, the invasion accelerated the fragmentation of communist movements, as parties in Italy, France, and Spain distanced themselves from Moscow, rejecting the legitimacy of intervention and developing alternative paths that emphasized national independence and democratic participation, a shift that weakened Soviet influence and exposed ideological fractures that propaganda could no longer conceal. Within the Eastern Bloc, the lesson was equally stark, as leaders and citizens alike internalized the boundaries enforced in Prague, learning that genuine political reform would be tolerated only so long as it did not challenge the monopoly of party power or the strategic cohesion of the Warsaw Pact, a realization that fostered caution, cynicism, and a retreat into private life rather than open rebellion. This retreat did not signify acceptance, but adaptation, as societies learned to survive within constrained systems by lowering expectations and separating personal integrity from public compliance, a survival strategy that preserved social stability while quietly undermining ideological commitment. The memory of 1968 lingered as a silent counter-narrative to official history, shaping dissident thought and informing later movements that sought change not through sudden rupture, but through moral pressure, legal argument, and international visibility. Strategies evident in initiatives like Charter 77, which invoked human rights commitments rather than ideological confrontation as a means of challenge. The Soviet Union itself was not immune to the consequences of intervention, as the invasion deepened its international isolation, complicated détente, and reinforced an image of a system reliant on force to maintain cohesion, an image that eroded the moral authority Moscow sought to project in the global contest with the West. Internally, the use of military power against a reformist ally reinforced conservative tendencies within Soviet leadership, discouraging experimentation and entrenching doctrines that equated stability with control, a mindset that would later hinder adaptation and contribute to systemic stagnation. The Prague Spring thus stands as a pivotal episode in the Cold War, not because it altered borders or alliances, but because it clarified the limits of the existing order and exposed the costs of preserving it through coercion, transforming a hopeful experiment into a cautionary tale that reverberated across ideological lines. When change finally came to Czechoslovakia in 1989, it unfolded peacefully and with remarkable speed, as if the suppressed aspirations of 1968 had merely been deferred rather than defeated, demonstrating that the ideals briefly realized during the Prague Spring had not vanished but endured beneath the surface, waiting for conditions to shift. This continuity between the hope of 1968 and the transformation of 1989 underscores the paradox of repression, that while it can delay change, it cannot eliminate the desire for dignity, autonomy, and participation that gave rise to reform in the first place. The Prague Spring's ultimate legacy, therefore, lies not in its failure but in its enduring influence, as a moment when an alternative vision of socialism briefly emerged, revealed its appeal, and was crushed, leaving behind lessons about power, legitimacy, and the human cost of ideological rigidity that remain relevant long after the Cold War's end. In telling this story, the Prague Spring serves as a reminder that history is shaped not only by those who prevail, but by those who imagine different possibilities and bear the consequences of pursuing them, and that even the most forceful suppression cannot fully erase the impact of a society's brief encounter with freedom. The final reckoning of the Prague Spring lies not in the tanks that rolled through Prague in August 1968, but in the enduring contrast it revealed between power and legitimacy, a contrast that would quietly undermine the Cold War order from within as the decades unfolded, because while the invasion succeeded in restoring control, it did so by extinguishing the last credible claim that socialist rule in Eastern Europe rested on popular consent rather than coercion. In Czechoslovakia, normalization imposed silence and predictability, but it also produced a society defined by disengagement, where public conformity masked private disbelief, and where the gap between official rhetoric and lived reality widened year by year, hollowing out the ideological foundations of the regime. This hollowing was not immediately visible, but it accumulated steadily, shaping a political culture in which obedience was transactional rather than loyal, and where the memory of 1968 served as a quiet benchmark against which all subsequent compromises were measured. Across Eastern Europe, the lesson of Prague reinforced caution among reformers and emboldened hardliners, freezing political development, while economic inefficiencies and social frustration deepened, creating systems that appeared stable but lacked resilience, a weakness that would become apparent when the external pressures sustaining them began to recede. The Brezhnev Doctrine, born of the invasion, codified this stagnation by defining sovereignty as conditional and reform as dangerous, locking the bloc into a posture of rigidity that limited adaptation and magnified the cost of eventual change. When that change finally arrived in the late 1980s, it did so with remarkable speed, as regimes collapsed not under the weight of external assault, but through the sudden withdrawal of coercive support and the rapid erosion of belief, revealing how thoroughly legitimacy had been depleted. In this sense, the Prague Spring was less a failed revolution than a deferred one, its aspirations resurfacing 2 decades later, when the constraints that had crushed them were lifted, and its memory providing both inspiration and caution to those who sought transformation without violence. For the broader Cold War, the episode marked a turning point in moral clarity, exposing the contradictions at the heart of a system that claimed to represent historical progress while suppressing its own reformers and accelerating ideological fragmentation that weakened Soviet influence even as military power remained formidable. The invasion demonstrated that control could be enforced, but not renewed, and that the preservation of order through force carried a long-term cost that no amount of stability could fully offset. The story of the Prague Spring thus endures as one of the Cold War's most poignant lessons, illustrating how the suppression of hope can sustain a system temporarily while ensuring its eventual exhaustion, and how moments of possibility, even when crushed, can leave traces that shape the future in ways power cannot fully control. In remembering 1968, the Prague Spring stands not only as a tragedy, but as evidence that legitimacy, once lost, cannot be restored by force, and that the true measure of political strength lies not in the ability to silence dissent, but in the capacity to accommodate change without fear.